The consent agenda.
Madam Chair, I move that we approve the consent agenda.
Second.
So moved and seconded to approve the consent agenda as listed. Any further discussion? Hearing none, all those in favor?
Aye.
Motion passes. Okay. Minutes ahead of time, but I think Darcy's ready with Clarion, so we can go ahead and do the land use plan update. Good morning, Darcy.
Good morning, commissioners. Can you hear us okay?
Yes, thank you.
Great. So I am joined this morning by Paul Donegan and Brian with TO Engineers. So we're gonna kind of tag team our update this morning for you. And I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen. Does that look all right? All right, so starting off with just kind of a recap on our overall timeline, I think we are kind of cruising along, really working kind of at this on a parallel track on phases 2, 3, and 4 at this point. One of the things that we heard from the community and from you guys when we were last with you in June is that, you know, time is of the essence. There is a sense of urgency to move the process along as quickly as possible. And, you know, we have made a couple of adjustments to try to be responsive to those concerns. We have moved up our public meeting that we were originally going to do in early November into early October, and we will continue to kind of try to push forward as quickly as we can while making sure we are still providing plenty of opportunities for public comment and, you know, kind of approaching this in a reasonable manner. But we definitely heard that sense of urgency and are trying to be responsive to that. So I'm going to touch on, we're going to talk about some of the specifics related to what we've been up to. In particular, we wanted to update you on the preliminary plan framework, which we presented to the community in June. And I want to make sure you guys can see the slides, correct?
Yes.
Okay. So we presented the kind of the first piece of the plan to the community back in June. So we want to tell you what we've heard through the follow-up engagement that we've been doing and kind of where we're headed with that in terms of the next steps for the process. And then Brian is going to talk about some of the work that he has been doing on the land suitability and demand analysis. And so I think this is a really key component. There's a lot of great work that's gone into that, and we're excited to have him give you just a preview of kind of what the information is that's there, and then we'll talk a little bit about next steps. So in terms of the plan framework, so if folks are watching and they're kind of new to the process, I just want to remind everyone kind of how we got to that point. So we started early in the spring with our vision and values survey, and that was we got a lot of responses to that. We got a lot of great information from that, and that was really our starting point. And so we derived the preliminary plan framework from the results of that vision survey, but also going back and looking at the 1998 land use plan. One of the things that we had heard coming out of the survey is that a lot of the things that were important to people back in 1998 were still really important to the community today. And so we really tried to be faithful to that plan and those ideas based on what we heard coming out of the vision and value survey. And we'll talk about some of the areas we're starting to see maybe where we need to kind of, you know, go a slightly different direction or tweak things. And, you know, we're continuing to massage that, but this is not kind of, you know, a lot of new you know, kind of out of left field ideas, I guess I would say, in terms of where are we coming up with these focus points. So really trying to build on what you've done, and then also your recent work on the natural resources management plan. So with that in mind, in terms of the feedback that we got, we had a lot of different opportunities for input between June and July. So we did, as you know, 3 in-person meetings when we were there, Powell, Matizzi, and Cody. Powell and Cody were definitely the best attended overall. Between those 3 nights, we had about 130 people participate. We had about 45 people who actually filled out what we call the blue or the pink sheets and submitted those to us. So we got a lot of good written feedback that way. We did a follow-up meeting the next week on Zoom, and it was not as well attended as we would like. And so we intend to push that harder this next round and just make sure people know that that opportunity is out there. We'll keep doing it. It's a pretty efficient way just to provide another opportunity for people who maybe couldn't participate in person, but we'd like to see that attendance go up. And then we did a follow-up, kind of a second survey based on what we presented in June, and push that out via e-blasts and through our LUPAC and other folks to let everyone know that that was out there. And that was open for 3 weeks, essentially. So when we wrapped up our meetings and then into mid-July. So we got about 107 responses to that survey. So we were pleased with that. I think we went ahead and entered in all of the written feedback that we got from our in-person meetings so that we have one compiled set of information, and we're working on buttoning up that summary today. So we will get that posted, and we will be sending out an e-blast that will be available on the website. So that will be something people can look at to see, you know, what happens when I provide feedback? What are we doing with this information? So we want to make sure that everyone knows we're keeping track of all the comments that we receive and weaving that into our work as we go forward. So in terms of participants, because we didn't get demographic information, the same level of information from in-person folks, this is kind of a two-part overview. But in terms of folks who either filled out one of the blue forms, which had more detailed questions, or took the survey, continuing to see the vast majority of respondents as full-time residents. We are also continuing to see, which really I was pleased about this in particular, that we are continuing to see some participation from all of the planning areas. And so I think you'll see the chart on the top. It's obviously somewhat dictated by the level of population that we have in different planning areas, but we are still continuing to see some involvement from each of the planning areas. And then the other thing that was encouraging, I think, in terms of, you know, are we continuing to get a range of folks involved in the process, is that we are seeing, you know, both folks on the younger end of the spectrum and on the older end of the spectrum through the process. So when we did the vision survey, the original survey, we had about half that were above 50 and half below, and we're still somewhat in that ballpark for this round of engagement. And then we had also seen kind of a similar, you know, scattering of participation from around the county in our in-person meetings. So we asked folks, you know, a little bit more informal, to put stickies on the map in terms of where they were from. So you can see kind of big clusters in Cody Powell rural and different areas. But we also used this to help us understand, you know, where people were coming from to go to the different meetings. So we definitely found, I think, that having a lot of different options is important. Even if, you know, someone can't make it one night, they have the option to go another night. And so flexibility between those different meeting options, which we'll be applying in October. And then what we wanted to do this morning is just very quickly give you some highlights. We've got the information in terms of what we were asking people to respond to, but our focus is really going to be on what we heard about these different things. And I'm going to start off, and then Paul's going to jump in and pick it up from there. But just as a reminder, we had an overall vision statement that was fairly simple, and then we jumped into some different value statements and ultimately the countywide goals. And this is really going to be, you know, kind of what helps shape the plan as we go forward into our next steps. About 59% of folks indicated that the vision statement reflected their vision well or perfectly. Some of the key takeaways, I think, from the open-ended comments and conversations that we had with folks was, a desire to really dig into and see their specific issues reflected directly in the vision statement. We also heard some feedback from a couple folks who said, that it's a little bit too grounded in where we were and maybe not as forward thinking as we might want it to be. And so we'll be looking at, tweaking that language a little bit to try to address some of those comments. But I would say that we were intentional in trying to keep the vision statement fairly concise so that we could get into more details in the value statements and then ultimately in the goals. So part of what I think we were seeing is that that's the first thing that people see, and they're wanting to see all of those details captured in that first thing that they set their eyes on. So we'll kind of keep an eye on that. We can always tweak that as we go through the process, but I think generally on the right track there. When we get into the value statements, there were 3 of them. Our rural landscapes was the first one, really focusing on the public lands and, kind of the value of those lands and the vistas, et cetera, that people really enjoy in Park County and protecting those resources. This one really resonated with people. 73% kind of leaned on that well or perfectly comment in terms of where they fell. One of the things that came up particularly in this section, but in later sections as well, is just we really are going to need to define pretty clearly what we mean by these terms. And so there were questions about, what do we mean by, I think I'm jumping the gun a little bit here, but thinking about how we define the terms that we're using and making sure we've got that. One of the things that is built into your 98 plan is a pretty thorough, in each of the planning areas is a pretty thorough glossary of terms. And so just something that we're keeping in mind, that wanting to let folks know early what they're responding to. This particular section, I think a lot of people said, yes, this is really what we want to see, but we are unclear about how actually this will happen or how it will be enforced. And so, indicating we're moving in the right direction, but really the devil's in the details in terms of the policies that come out of this and ultimately the implementation. One of the potential gaps that came up in this section, but also in a couple other sections, folks had noted that, solar and wind really wasn't a focus back in 1998, hadn't really come up in many of our, really at all in our early conversations, but something that should be on the radar in terms of policy direction and potentially regulatory recommendations coming out of the plan. In terms of the different sets of goals, we're just going to wanted to just kind of quickly run through the general sentiment. I think by and large, you'll see, and I'm glad that we asked, kind of specific questions about each of the sets of goals, because you definitely see as you go through that in some cases, much higher, in some cases lower, and that's really going to help guide us as we get into the countywide policies to refine the goals, think more clearly about, what do we want to get into or what do we need to address in each of these areas in terms of policies. Related to growth management, about 58% or more in some cases. This is a case where some of the goals ranked higher than others. This was a case also where the wording was important to people. And so there were particular goal that talked about encouraging growth in a certain location. People really wanted to focus it more on managing or balancing growth. Again, implementation, property rights were a big issue here. And then thinking about how we define terms like development, what do we mean? And so kind of clarity in the language moving forward. Private land use, a lot of open-ended comments in this section. And this was a particular topic and group of goals that really kind of came out of the 98 plan as well. 60% indicated that the first 2 really resonated with them. The last one did not. And I think this was related to the goal was balancing private property rights with the needs of the community. And there was a lot of back and forth in the comments, I think, different sides of different perspectives on kind of what the importance was of that versus private property rights. And so that's something we're going to continue to see woven throughout all of the sections of the plan, and kind of how that is nuanced in the policies and the recommendations. So we'll be looking more closely at that in our countywide policy draft. Infrastructure and public services. I think this is another case where some of the goals resonated more clearly than others. And so we'll be looking at that to refine those ideas as we go forward. Some of the questions, comments that came up here, thinking about cost and kind of fiscal responsibility in the context of infrastructure and services, kind of where we grow, what are the costs associated with that to the county, to others. Other folks weighed in on the importance of, just making sure people understand the role of the districts that are operating within the county and kind of who does what related to infrastructure. So I'm going to turn it over to Paul, and he can kind of run us through our next two sections.
All right. So the second sort of shared value related to resources and heritage, the general feedback and sentiment that we received on the next slide was similar to the first one, pretty strongly favorable, and as people feeling that value really captured their vision well or perfectly. There was, I think, in the open-ended comments, some concern about what compromises could be required to achieve goals. Worried that a lot of these things are really important, but that there is some amount of balancing that goes on with preserving resources and heritage while also allowing for development and people to use their property in the way that they would like. There was a desire for more emphasis on protecting nature and sort of the natural beauty of the county. And then sort of a discussion about the benefits and impacts of economic growth and development, sort of similarly recognizing that there is some give and take there with, as the county grows, there are impacts on natural resources. So within the specific goals for economic development, I think 55 to 65% felt that the goals reflected what they wanted for Park County, either well or perfectly. I think there was a mix of opinions in this section about what role the county should really be taking in terms of economic development. How much should the county really be pushing that in terms of, the role of government, but also I think whether people want the county to grow. I think there was recognition that if we are not wanting to grow so much, that advancing economic development would also push growth, and that linkage there. And then I think some places where there was some clarification and some, just raising of concerns about homegrown businesses, what that really means in one of those goals. And then also just, we'd highlighted, a desire for improved communication networks and people sort of saying, well, there's some pros and cons to cell towers and extending internet service, and really there's some cost and benefit there as well. On the next slide, environment and natural resources, these were pretty highly rated by respondents, 63 to 77%. I think here we saw a lot of desire for greater emphasis on water. And so that's something that we've talked about, maybe pulling that out as a separate section from environment and natural resources, and really just having a water focused set of goals and policies, which I think is currently how the 1998 plan is set up. So it'd sort of be, instead of consolidating those as we propose, I think maybe keeping that separate and highlighting the importance of water. I think some of the comments we heard also have to do with private property rights and how this, public land and private lands, the interface there, it can be a little bit tricky, and how the county can play a role there. And I think a desire for a little bit more specific direction in here in the goals about wildlife and the environment. And I think some of those points where we got comments about wanting more specifics, that'll come about in the next draft when we're providing some policy statements, because I think in some cases, this is a goal. It's not really going to get into the how the goal is going to be achieved necessarily, whereas the policies and implementation measures and that sort of thing really get at, if we want to achieve this goal, here's how we're going to do it. On the next section, agriculture, also people had very positive feelings about this one. This is, in most cases, people generally rated things well, and I think this is one where perfectly really outpaced well. And so people, I think, although the number 62 to 70% is similar to the other sections, it is the favorability is a lot, I think, stronger. And so I think there was, like we saw in other sections, some different perspective about what role the county should play in terms of protecting land from development and supporting agricultural businesses, similar to that economic development section. It's yes, we like this, but what really should the county be doing versus letting people sort of deal with that on their own. And I think that there was specifically some interest in focusing on subdivisions and how those can be designed differently so that there can be development, but maybe not with the same impacts. And then I think some more specific things about how agriculture, the existing, I think, direction is maybe more focused on traditional agriculture, but recognizing that there are changes in the way agricultural businesses are operating. There's different methods for protecting land, and maybe some are more favorable than others. And then I think looking at the sustainability of agriculture was another thing people raised, and that's in terms of longevity, wanting to make sure that these businesses are sustainable in the long term, also how water is used, recognizing that water is really important.
And Paul, one quick thing just to add, I think that came up not so much in the survey responses, but in our public meetings. I think that was a big takeaway for me, was that, we definitely heard meeting in different locations and kind of hearing from different folks, the distinctions in the types of agriculture that are happening in different planning areas. So as we get into our next round of discussion and kind of dig deeper, I think that was definitely something that kind of stood out, that, we have certain areas that are focused on seed production. We have certain areas that are focused on cattle and other types of ag. And so just, kind of, that's our opportunity, I think, to work with the community to try to really tailor policies where we need to get at, exactly what's happening in each of those areas.
All right, and then for historic preservation, there was really just one goal here, and it had pretty high favorability in terms of how it was written. And I think some of the open-ended comments really got at sort of, looking at, there are impacts to historic preservation. And I think that there's an opportunity to have a better discussion, I think, as we get into the policies in terms of what role the county plays versus, other organizations in the area, and really like how private property rights can be balanced and make it something that really the people who want to do some historic preservation are able to do that, but maybe clarifying that it's not necessarily something where the county is coming in and saying you need to protect a certain building or something like that. And then there was a few comments just sort of highlighting, well, they'd like a little bit more specifics on like how citizens specifically are involved, how tribes that have historically called Park County home are involved in terms of identifying resources and preserving them. The final shared value, dealing with culture and sense of community. This policy, I think, as the next slide shows, was also pretty highly favorable. I think within each of those shared values, I think the overall concept was really, people felt like it was well representative of what they wanted. I think some of the open-ended comments here really have to do on, I think some of the I think momentum is towards, embracing a Western culture that some residents feel as maybe like more focused on what tourists expect to see when they're visiting Park County, and kind of finding a balance for the community culture that is a little bit more focused on what people that live in Park County think is really important, and not not necessarily what people that visit Park County think is important. And then also I think some recognition that, hey, like how the community develops and grows has a pretty important impact on culture and sense of community. So I think that's the basis there. For housing, this one sort of had a wide mix. I think 56% to 72% is a pretty big range in terms of favorability. There was, I think, mixed opinions on how the county is involved in the housing market, and in terms of promoting a building code. And I think that there was a fair amount of comments on both of those, though the safe construction practices was sort of the more highly rated of the two. There was some specific concerns raised about lack of affordable housing, senior housing that's affordable and stable, and then sort of a general support for having an emphasis by the county to focus more of the higher density, growth towards incorporated areas and within incorporated areas. In terms of culture, this one was really highly rated. 73 to 80% felt like these goals were reflected their goals for Park County well or perfectly. There was some desire for more clear definitions about what culture we're wanting to protect. And so I think that that's another place where that'll kind of come out in the policies. And then also just recognizing that there is a balance with, these landscapes that people really value and think are important to the culture, and what preserving those looks like and how that might impact property rights. And on the next slide, government, these were very highly rated. I think there was some comments specifically about, being realistic about local control and not necessarily staking out a position of the county, I think, taking over more control, as much as looking for ways that the county can, be a partner with these state and federal agencies that own so much land in the county, and how the county can really, leverage, what people want to achieve what they want, recognizing that there's the reality of the situation is there's so much of the land in the county is not within the county's jurisdiction. And then there was also, I think, some specific issues raised here with people having concerns about specific zoning, how the landfills were working, different county operations. So there was this one, in terms of the open-ended comments, had the most specific, detailed things that came out. And then, unless Darcy has any wrap-up summary on that, I think we'll be handing it over to Brian to talk about the land suitability analysis.
Yeah, and I guess we can pause there for just a moment and see if there's, are there any questions on any of the kind of responses or what we've just talked about?
Mr. Teal?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Darcy, this is Commissioner Lloyd Teal. My question is basically, this isn't your first land use plan, but it is mine. So my question is, how does Park County compare as far as response and public involvement based per, population? We have a population of only, around 30,000 people. And to me, the number seems very low as far as public participation. How are we comparing to others?
So I think in terms of one of the things we've talked about is, why we put such a strong emphasis on the initial survey, and that it is pretty standard in a process that extends over, a fair amount of time, like we have here, that we see the most participation in that first round of engagement. So we really put a lot of emphasis on that. And we were really, I think, comfortable with the level of participation we got there. That's really why we're basing a lot on that. I think in terms of the participation in the meetings, I think obviously we would have preferred to have kind of a Powell and a Cody level of participation at all of our in-person meetings. That would be, I think, a reasonable expectation, and certainly what we're hoping to see when we do our 4 in-person kind of evening meeting. Well, we'll have more than 4, but when we do our next round of meetings in October, I think what we tend to find is that, when we are at this higher level, that people, we're going to get people who are going to respond to every single round of engagement. We're going to get other people who are going to show up when it really starts impacting them specifically. And so my hope and, I think our goal is that for our meetings in October and then the subsequent meetings where we are really talking about planning area specific recommendations, that we can drive those numbers higher. So I think, there's no way to sort of say what's good or bad, I think, in terms of other communities, but I think we have seen higher participation here than we have in some larger counties. At this stage of the process, I think it's reasonable, but I think we want to see it get higher in October and our next round early in the year when we've got the draft plan.
Okay, thank you. I just was wondering in comparison per capita with other studies that you've done, because to date, we're well under 1% of participation for population.
Yeah, and like I said, so for the first round, I think that was a reasonable, kind of representative cross-section of the community for the vision and values survey. It is not typical that we will see that at every step, so.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions right now? Thanks, Darcy. We can go on.
Okay. All right. So in terms of the land suitability analysis, I'm just going to quickly set the stage and then turn it over to Brian, just to remind folks kind of we're shifting, from this high level countywide goal, vision, values discussion, and starting to think about, how do we apply those values to the county on the ground, and where might we be, running into potential conversations about trade-offs or potential conflicts. And so the purpose of this land suitability analysis and the demand analysis that EPS is working on that kind of dovetails with that is really to help us kind of narrow the focus. And so we are trying to take what is a very large geography and think about, where might these policies really come into play? Where are we going to have the biggest impact? So there's a screening process, and Brian's going to kind of talk us through that. We're wanting to screen out what's undevelopable, to kind of take that off the table right off the bat. We're looking at the areas that are most attractive for development, suitable for development. So kind of where are we going to see, have we seen, and where are we likely to see the greatest pressure for development? And that's really where we need to focus the conversation in October and through our subsequent conversations to say, if we're not happy with how things are going in these particular areas, we expect we're going to continue to see pressure. What are our options? And that's really what we're trying to get to next is, kind of looking at those pinch points, and then also what options we might have from a policy perspective, from a regulatory perspective, as a follow-up to this plan, to help address those. And that's hopefully where we're going to stir up a lot more conversation with the community about, kind of how that moves forward. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Brian.
Thank you. So the first slide that we're looking at here is the prohibitive factors. So the first thing we want to do in a land suitability analysis is identify the lands that are not suitable for development at all. And so in this case, we have municipalities, our public lands, so your state and federal, railroads, roads that are county owned, and then we also distinguish the difference between county owned and non-county owned roads, and then also wetlands. And so wetlands would cover your typical wetlands, but also lakes, rivers, reservoirs. And so what we end up with is Park County as a whole is about 4.5 million acres. And then when you remove the prohibitive factors, and I'm sorry, there's a bar, I can't see the bottom there, but if I look at my records, basically we start with 4.5 million acres, and then what we're left with is approximately 750,000 acres. And that is the blue outline on this graphic. Next slide, please. So the next thing that we're looking at is the different criteria and weighting that criteria. So for example, we're looking at the distance to infrastructure municipal, so like your Cody water and sewer lines. Then we're looking at distance to infrastructure rural, such as the Northwest Rural Water District, and then also distance to municipality. And the way that we're looking at distance to municipality would be essentially your distance to services such as hospitals and schools, police and fire stations. Then we're also looking at distance to road. And then beyond that, we're looking at slope and soils. And so beyond this, we recently met with a technical working group, and as part of that, we identified a need to break out the roads. And so we're going to be breaking out the roads for gravel roads, paved roads, and unimproved roads. And then for the soil, we're also going to look at building suitability as well. Next slide. So there's the weighting process is pretty subjective, and which is why we're involving the technical working group to get some feedback from them. And so, for example, in this scenario, what we're looking at for the weighted overlay is a percent weights. And so essentially what we're looking at is an average of those 6 criteria that we put into the model. And with that, you can see, for example, we would consider this a more conservative model. And so with this, for example, we're only showing approximately 4,300 acres of suitable, or with a suitability score of 4. And then if we look at the next slide, so the next slide is relative weights. And what we mean by that is that this is a pairwise comparison between 2 different features. So for example, is soil more or less important than slope, or is soil more or less important than distance to roads, or are they equal? And so we're going to be working with the technical working group on an exercise to get their feedback on that. But what you notice is that when we do this pairwise comparison, and we actually sort of rank these different features in order of importance, what that turns into is a model that now displays approximately 35,100 acres of suitable land, or a score of 4. And if we look at the next slide, we kind of zoom in on the area right around Cody. And so, for example, what you can see here is that the areas northeast and northwest of Cody are some of the more suitable areas. So especially right next to Cody along the east edge there, you can see that's where we have some of the more highly suitable lands. And if we look at the next slide, please. You know, if you look at that compared to the percent weight, the average, you can see that there's less suitability, especially along, say, for example, Road 2AB. So what that is to show is that this is very subjective, in that we need to get input on the different, the different stakeholders throughout the county on, identifying what is more important than other criteria, and weight those. And the end product will be a map that shows where the most suitable land is for development throughout the county, and then also, in turn, identify where land is, less than suitable. So I think that's all I have for that.
Questions for Brian?
One of the questions that's come up in some of the discussions that we've had, and I guess I would think about when you're talking about roads and all those types of things, and I haven't heard it brought up with the plan yet, but is there any way to look at, or at least acknowledge, emergency response type of locations? I mean, there's some places in Park County that may be, I'll use this green on the map, but they're a long ways from any help. And is that ever discussed when you're doing a land use plan like this?
Yeah, I think, go ahead, Brian. There's 2 parts to that, I think.
Yeah, so I would say in this situation, that's one of the topics that we discussed in the technical working group. And so one of our criteria is the distance from municipality. And so another way to look at that is distance from services, because the majority of your services are in the municipality, and we're going to be making some adjustments to that. And Darcy, I do, I do believe that this is being shown in the model. So, for example, I'm in the North Fork region, and I'd say that my property is suitable to build on, but it also has a suitability score of 2, and I think one of those reasons is just the distance that I have to some of these services, and I think as we adjust the model, especially changing our buffers on the municipalities, I think that's going to become more apparent.
And then the other side to that we talked about with the technical working group is that, there's sort of the technical analysis of, these tangible features, but there are also policy considerations that we're going to need to get into in terms of the maps really are focused on where are we likely to see development or where could we support development. They're not necessarily saying these are places we want to encourage development at the same level. And so that's going to be that next layer of conversation about, here's what the model is telling us are areas that are potentially suitable and we may see pressure for development or are already doing that. So let's talk about, are there areas within a particular planning area that we, from a policy perspective for reasons like access to services, we may want to encourage growth in a different area. So it's definitely part of the conversation. I think it's just not necessarily the primary focus of this screening process we're going through right now beyond what Brian talked about. We definitely got into that a little bit with our technical working group.
Okay, and then just one other thing, I guess, just observation wise, looking at the map with the green on the east side of Cody and looking at the questions that we've had over the last year with development on ag lands, excuse me, we'll be able to put an overlay of ag basically over a layer like this to kind of know where those conflicts exist, where it might be suitable for development, but it's also existing ag land.
Yes, that is correct. The next phase of once we feel good about where we're at with the model, the next thing we're going to be looking at is different scenarios. So looking at the critical wildlife habitats, agriculture land, irrigated land, et cetera.
Thanks, Brian.
Any other questions on that piece?
No.
Okay. All right. So in terms of next steps, a couple things, broke this into 2 parts. So basically, there are a variety of things that we'll be working on over the next month or so, and are continuing to work on. Kind of the as I mentioned earlier, the dovetail piece to the work that Brian's been helping us with, sort of on the map end, is the actual growth projections. And so, based on the initial projections and kind of analysis that was done back in May that EPS had put together, I think the sentiment was, these are probably too conservative. We need to look at some other pieces of information. And so EPS has been working on kind of modeling a range of growth projections. So the state demographer being on the low end, and then kind of more recent trends kind of being the high end. So if we see a continuation of what we have been seeing over the last 2 years, where does that take us? So that will leave us with a range of possibilities that we will be able to use to kind of inform this, the demand discussion. So taking the maps and then starting to look at, how much demand, or how much growth have we seen in particular areas in recent years? If we were to see a similar amount, what that might mean for future years. And that really is what we're going to use to inform those scenarios that Brian talked about. So it's probably, kind of based just on some areas being much more suitable and having much more land that is suitable for development, focused in particular areas. There will be some specific questions for all the planning areas, but I think, definitely a lot of focus on Cody Powell area and, South Fork, North Fork, those areas. So that's kind of the companion piece to that. We'll talk more about that next time we meet with you. But that's really going to be putting the numbers and the acreages, kind of helping us marry those 2 pieces of information. Brian mentioned kind of the next steps in terms of refining the land suitability analysis. After we met with our technical working group last week, there was definitely an interest from that group of kind of continuing the conversation. We are going to refine that information, put together kind of a summary of the assumptions, and then send out a quick survey to that group to get additional feedback on some of the weighting criteria. We just ran out of time last week. We had a lot to chew through, but the group was really engaged and wanted to continue to be involved in that discussion. So we'll keep that moving with our technical working group. And then as we've been going through and looking at kind of what we've been hearing on the plan framework, Paul has really been kind of taking the lead on pulling together a first draft of the countywide policies. I think one of the things that we've observed and kind of getting into that next level is that the planning area policy statements, there are some things that are very specific to the planning areas, but there are a lot of things that really apply at the countywide level. And so we're kind of trying to work through and reconcile things that we think could be applied at a countywide level so that when we get to the planning area discussions, it can be a pretty narrow focus in terms of these are truly issues that are unique to a particular planning area, just to make it easier for the public to really grasp onto, but also for the county to administer the plan moving forward. So that's kind of an ongoing piece that we've got going in the background. And then as a follow-up to the June meetings, we also met again with the water providers to talk about, kind of how we frame the discussion about water. There were a lot of questions about it, particularly at our CODI meeting. And so we are working on kind of started as a 1-pager, it's going to turn into a 2-pager to kind of really look at summarize for the public and ultimately for the purposes of kind of, including in the plan, kind of the basic facts and figures about kind of what the supply is, what the issues are related to, kind of water provision and how that fits into this overall process. So that will be a standalone thing, but like I said, that's going to weave into the plan and our conversations in October for sure in terms of, these are the parameters that we're working with as we start to talk about growth, just to ground that conversation. So we'll be continuing to work with those folks on that as well. And then we will be, as we get into the scenarios with Brian and EPS, starting to really frame up those key policy considerations for each of the planning areas. So what choices, what are the conflicts, what options do we have to really wrestle with in terms of how we might address those? And that's really going to be the focus of our October meetings. So in terms of kind of upcoming opportunities for input, I mentioned the technical working group. We are doing kind of a supplemental meeting with the LUPAC at the end of this month. And our plan is to use them as kind of our test group to walk through the information, kind of a working draft of the information that we are working on pulling together for the October meetings to help us refine our approach. Is it too much information? Do we need to provide more detail on certain things and kind of, give us a dry run, if you will, on kind of how we approach those October meetings. We are planning to, since we will be asking very specific questions about specific, options, we want to make sure we can hear from everyone in the room, and our plan at this point is to use polling, kind of live polling for those meetings so that we can, kind of see those reactions, talk about what we're hearing from folks, and kind of just take a different approach for this next round of meetings. So as I mentioned at the beginning, we did move those up from November. So hopefully we will, get some good participation at those meetings. We'll be starting to push out advertising for those probably early September, just to get those on folks' calendar and make sure that we get good participation in those, and working with the LUPAC to really get the word out about those meetings as well. Just similar to what we did in June, we'll have a follow-up meeting on Zoom, and then also have that online input opportunity through October 31st. And that's really where I think after we get through our first round of meetings, we will be, you know, kind of working with the LUPAC members to kind of push out and really, you know, help us drive participation online to supplement that in-person input as well. And that is all that we have for today. Are there other questions about next steps or process generally?
Any questions from the commissioners or the audience, I guess, at this point? I don't see any questions, Darcy.
All right, thanks so much for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you.